Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Ignacio Ortiz was sitting in the stands of a large sports arena, marveling as his 17-year-old daughter, Dorotea, who was performing feats of flexibility and artistry on the makeshift arena made of mats. Her movements were graceful. She made a long silk ribbon obediently twist around her slender legs, then executed a sharp flip, tossing the ribbon handle into the air, only to catch it skillfully as her body gracefully spun around its own axis. The audience erupted in applause, and a happy smile lit up Dorothea's face. She waved goodbye to the spectators in a friendly manner. The young girl left the mat. Her performance had come to an end. "Dad, did you like it?" Dorothea asked her father with excitement in her voice, while tightly tying the laces on her light-colored sneakers. "What can I say? You're a professional, my dear. A true fairy on stage." Ignacio replied with a smile. "If I hadn't seen you work tirelessly for 10 hours straight in the gym, I would never have imagined that all these ribbon movements were such intense work." "Oh, come on," the girl shrugged. "I have regular training sessions, nothing special. Look at the Olympic champions, they're the ones who work with such dedication. It's beyond anything I could have imagined. Can you believe that sometimes they sleep only 4 hours a day? And then it's straight to training. No, Dad, compared to them, I'm just an amateur." Dorothea shook her head, and her father gently stroked her hand instead of saying more. He knew very well how important artistic gymnastics was to her and how much strength and time his daughter devoted to this beautiful yet incredibly challenging pursuit. "You always underestimate your efforts and talent," Ignacio softly said. "It reminds me a lot of your mother. She would doubt herself every time the topic of exhibiting her paintings in a gallery came up. She was always afraid of large exhibitions." Dorothea looked at him with a hint of sadness. "If you only knew how much I miss her, Dad," the girl said thoughtfully, adjusting the antique silver bracelet on her wrist, the only memory of her mother Agata that remained after her passing. Once, her father had given this lovely trinket to his bride as a symbol of their deep love, and she had never taken it off since. When Dorothea turned 12, Ignacio gifted her the Agata bracelet, and just like her mother, the girl always wore it on her right hand. "Sweetheart, you did an amazing job. Your mother would be proud of you, believe me," her father reassured her. "After all, this was just a preliminary showcase. You still have plenty of time to refine the elements you're not completely sure about." Dorothea looked at her father with genuine gratitude and love. "You know how incredibly lucky I am to have a father like you? You're the best dad in the world." The girl embraced her father around his neck and gave him a light peck on the cheek. "Are you going back to work now?" she asked. "I am," Ignacio replied with a sigh. "What can I do if my managers can't make a single deal without me?" The father and daughter looked at each other understandingly and burst into laughter together. They both knew that managers had nothing to do with it. Ignacio, being a successful businessman, loved to plan and negotiate deals on his own terms. That's why he often stayed late at his office or had been on business trips for weeks. The businessman didn't trust anyone with his business, not even his most trusted individuals, and preferred to maintain control over everything happening within his company. Such humor helped him lighten the mood when his daughter would have loved to spend a few more hours with him, but she understood, to her great regret, that it was impossible. "All right. Thank you for coming today," she said to Ignacio. "It meant a lot to me, really. Sweetheart, remember you will always be my priority, no matter what happens." "Always," the businessman repeated once again. They both got into his luxurious car and headed towards Ignacio's country mansion. After dropping Dorothea off at home and bidding her farewell, the businessman immediately headed to his office. He had an important matter scheduled for today, and he truly hoped that luck would finally be on his side. The partners from France, whom the businessman had been longing to close a contract with for a long time, had finally taken notice of his company's successes. Now, Ignacio had high expectations of making a highly advantageous deal with them. As they drove, the man involuntarily delved into his own memories. Few people, looking at this polished and well-groomed 45-year-old man, would think that he was born and raised in an ordinary family, but that's exactly how it was. Ignacio's parents worked at the same factory. His father was a welder in the hot workshop, and his mother was a cook in the factory canteen. It wasn't easy for young Ignacio to rise through his own social environment. A boy who dreamt of wealth and serious business practically since childhood didn't fit the ideals of the so-called working youth of those times. Some considered him arrogant and conceited, while others directly called him a failure and warned him that striving for more would only backfire, and Ignacio shouldn't get involved in anything more complex than construction tools or drafting compasses. However, young Ignacio didn't find it shameful to be the odd one out among his peers, and he steadily pursued his goal of mastering the business world. His family at home wasn't particularly supportive, but unlike his mother, who worried excessively about her overly ambitious son's future, his father, Valerio, at least believed that the young man could achieve something. "Don't worry so much about him, Zoe," Valerio would say. "He's a smart boy. He studies all day long. Perhaps he will truly make something of himself in the big city. Why should he waste his time working with us at the factory for the rest of his life?" Zoe could only shake her head and cry. "Valerio, dear, just look at him. How can our son be a businessman? It's ridiculous. He's so frail, so weak. He even got an exemption from physical education. They'll eat him alive there, that's for sure." Nevertheless, Ignacio himself was absolutely confident that he would succeed in his plans, so he diligently prepared for admission to the economics faculty throughout the summer after finishing school. The boy's hard work and dedication eventually paid off. After enrolling in a state-funded university, Ignacio immediately moved to the capital, where he was even assigned a room in a student dormitory. The boy's mother didn't believe it until the last moment that her poor boy was going to conquer the big city, but her husband explained to her that such a smart and talented young man as their son had no place in their fading village. "Understand, Zoe," Valerio tried to reason with her, "he has absolutely no future here, unlike in the capital, where he can apply all his skills and practice." Zoe continued to cry, but eventually she resigned herself. She sincerely wanted her son to succeed and find happiness in the bustling and vibrant metropolis. Over the next 5 years, Ignacio delighted his parents and professors with his academic achievements. He was considered one of the best students in his course at the university, consistently earning top grades each semester. Ignacio's father was very proud of him, and even his mother began to realize that her husband was right. They were already making grand plans for their son's future when a terrible tragedy struck their lives. Both parents died in a devastating fire that occurred on their property due to the negligence of their intoxicated neighbors. The neighbors had a party at their house and failed to keep an eye on the stove, and during the night, the fire rapidly spread to the Valerio's bathhouse, which was adjacent to their neighbor's house, separated only by an old flimsy fence. When Ignacio's father woke up and rushed to extinguish the fire, it was already too late. The bathhouse was almost completely consumed by the flames, and the fire began to approach the Ortiz's house. Trying to put out the fire, the couple exhausted all the water supplies they had on their property and were about to give up. Especially since the firefighters were in no hurry to arrive in their remote village that was far from the district center. The husband and wife tried to salvage their most valuable possessions from the fire, the money and documents accumulated over many years of hard work, and at that moment, a heavy beam from the collapsed structure fell on them with a terrifying crash. When the police arrived at the scene of the tragedy together with the specialists, they concluded it was an accident. Ignacio's parents had died almost instantly, and there was no one to blame for their death. Ignacio, who was in his final year of university at the time, fell into a state of shock upon learning of his parents' death. He couldn't eat for several days, and during the funerals and subsequent memorial services, he couldn't utter a single word. Grief corroded his shattered heart like black rust, and the young man no longer desired anything from his life. The deaths of his closest and dearest people seemed to have finally broken him, destroying all the joy and determination on which he had lived in recent years. A week after it had happened, Ignacio found the first glimmering strand of gray hair on his temple. In that moment, he fully realized that his youth had come to an end and that he had become an adult. Upon returning to the city, the young man's first task was to sell his parents' property. He never wanted to go back to the village again. Too many painful events had occurred there, and Ignacio wanted to permanently close the door on that part of his past. After settling all the matters related to the land, the aspiring businessman immersed himself back into his studies, trying to ignore the fact that his fellow students were looking at him with pity. His main goal now was to graduate from university with honors. He wanted to honor the memory of his parents and prove to himself that all of this, his studies and moving to the capital, had not been in vain. The only person who had supported him throughout this whole time was his girlfriend, Agata. She was studying on the same course as Ignacio but had chosen the field of art history. The young student was enamored with painting and architecture and was a decent artist herself, although she never believed enough in her own abilities to start creating art instead of studying it. Agata admired Ignacio's perseverance and determination. When he was almost broken by the tragedy of losing his family, she did everything possible to ensure he didn't feel alone. It was during that time that Ignacio first started pondering that his feelings for Agata were really strong. Realizing that she had been his pillar of support throughout those dark times, Ignacio gathered the courage and proposed to her. "Will you marry me?" He asked Agata in the courtyard of the Philharmonic after they left the concert untimely. To make his words sound more solemn, Ignacio knelt down in front of his beloved and presented her with a small, open heart-shaped box wrapped in red velvet. Inside, on a silky white cushion, lay a golden engagement ring with a tiny, sparkling diamond, shining like a star. "Oh my goodness, Ignacio!" Agata exclaimed in admiration. "What a beauty!" Ignacio looked at her expectantly, his gaze filled with a certain tension. Agata was momentarily taken aback, slightly surprised by the situation, but then joyfully exclaimed, "Yes. Of course, I will, my love." It seemed for Ignacio that a stone had fallen out of his heart. In a rush of emotions, he twirled Agata in a light dance before tenderly kissing his bride-to-be. After their wedding, life gained new colors for Ignacio. His first priority was to find a job that would allow them to rent a nice apartment and continue the cultured lifestyle they had become accustomed to during their student years. Armed with his documents and credentials, Ignacio embarked on interviews at any decent company willing to consider him for a position as an economist or financial analyst. After the third interview, he was accepted into a promising young firm that dealt with construction material supply nationwide. It was in this company that he would work until the moment he was offered the opportunity to lead it. Agata was also not inclined to rely on her young husband for support, so she quickly found a position as a staff tour guide at one of the capital's museums. It wasn't as prestigious as being a true art historian, but it was certainly better than running around as a waitress in some cheap dive while her diploma gathered dust on the shelf, serving no purpose to society. The young couple worked hard and then could disappear for days, immersing themselves in theaters or attending fashionable exhibitions. For a while, they lived for themselves, enjoying each other's company and the emotions they shared. Agata's parents, however, were not pleased with this arrangement and constantly pressured their daughter to give them grandchildren. But Agata was determined to establish herself first and then focus on expanding her own family. "I don't like your progressive look, my dear," Agata's mother Eleonora would sigh every time she visited her daughter and son-in-law. "Your father and I are not getting any younger. When will you give us your little ones to care for?" "Mom, there's no need for anyone to care for them," Agata would object with a smile. "Not now, not later. Ignacio and I are independent adults, fully capable of raising our own children. If we ever need your help, it will only be on rare occasions. Don't worry." Agata's mother would purse her lips and gaze at her daughter with sadness. She never imagined that in her old age, she would be confronted with her own flesh and blood's reluctance to have children. If you were adults, you would have been looking after children long ago instead of endlessly indulging in cultural events. How much longer can it go on? Eleonora, despite being a lifelong urban resident, belonged to the so-called old school. She couldn't understand why her daughter and Ignacio didn't live like all the normal daughters of her friends, why they didn't give birth to plump little darlings whose laughter would fill the space of their spacious two-bedroom apartment from morning till night. It seems you've completely forgotten what a woman's true mission is, haven't you? Agata asked her mother reproachfully. Mom, please, let's not start this again, Agata pleaded, rolling her eyes. Well, let me remind you. It's not difficult for me, Eleonora continued, seemingly oblivious to her daughter's objections. A woman's mission is to give birth, raise children, and pass on all her knowledge and love to the next generation. Agata would cover her ears with her hands each time to avoid hearing the same old argument. Her mother had been a middle school teacher at a comprehensive school her whole life, and she had given birth to Agata relatively late by her friend's standards, when she was already in her 30s. However, whenever she engaged in such conversations with her daughter, it always turned out that she had valid reasons for doing so, which, apparently, Agata lacked. Mom, I promise you, when Ignacio and I decide to have a child, you and Dad will be the first to know, Eleonora's daughter replied wearily, unable to go against her stubbornness. Well, how much longer do I have to wait? The woman said displeased, then abruptly changed the subject to something unrelated. Ignacio and Agata lived without children for several more years before they felt fully ready to have a son or daughter. Agata was 28 years old at the time. Despite some concerns from doctors regarding her age, she successfully carried their future daughter for the majority of the term. Of course, like all pregnant women, she experienced mild morning sickness and swelling in the first trimester, but all of that passed relatively quickly, and Agata felt simply wonderful afterward. By that time, Ignacio had become a successful top manager in his company, and the CEO informed him that he saw him as his future successor, stating that only someone like Ignacio could ensure the company's proper development after he retired. Ignacio took his boss's word seriously and was willing to work 2 or 3 times harder if the company required it. However, he had no intention of missing the birth of his daughter. He made it clear to the management that he would not miss the delivery. Surprisingly, the director reacted calmly, to the extent that he trusted his best employee. As a result, Ignacio was granted something like a mini maternity leave for the time of the birth. There were no signs of trouble, and Agata was already choosing a name for their little girl when shocking news struck like a bolt from the blue, Eleonora's death. That day, Ignacio called Agata's father and told him that his wife had suffered a heart attack during the night. Ignacio was devastated by the news and didn't know how to tell Agata about it. He was deeply concerned that such a shock could negatively affect the baby, so initially, he even considered not telling his wife until she would give a birth, so as not to worry her. However, his plan failed because Agata quickly realized that something had happened at home just by looking at his face. "You're hiding something from me, I can see it," Ignacio said to Agata, lying in the maternity ward and gently caressing her large round belly. "Understand that not telling me anything only makes it worse." Her husband looked at her beloved wife, and in his eyes, Agata read regret and pain. "What happened?" she asked again, more insistently. "Something happened with my parents?" "Don't be silent, just tell me." Ignacio took a deep breath before slowly uttering, "Yes, my dear Agata. Please don't worry. Your mother." "What? What happened?" his wife said, paling, although she had already understood that something terrible had happened. "She's no longer with us," Ignacio said softly, lowering his head. For the next few moments, Agata sat silently, completely still. Ignacio began to worry if she had gone into shock, but suddenly, his wife burst into sobs, repeatedly saying, "Mom, my dear Mom, why did you leave?" Ignacio tried to comfort her as best he could, but he quickly noticed that his wife's sobbing had turned into painful cries. He called a nurse, who quickly examined Agata and felt her abdomen, confirming that she was in labor. "Oh God, it hurts so much." Agata cried out once again as she was wheeled into the delivery room. Ignacio had been by her side all this time, saying encouraging words to her, although after so many years he couldn't quite remember what exactly he had said. He wasn't allowed into the operating room, so Ignacio had to spend the next few hours in the corridor, sitting on a hard, uncomfortable chair and listening to his wife's continuous cries coming from behind the doors. The businessman remembered that at some point his nerves got the better of him, and he simply blacked out. He only came to when the doctor who was delivering Agata's baby forcefully shook him by the shoulder. "Ignacio, are you feeling okay? Please wake up," the doctor said. He struggled to regain his composure and started rubbing his face with his palms to regain alertness. When he looked up at the doctor, he immediately sensed that something was wrong. Her face was pale as chalk, and the hand that had just woken him up was icy cold and lifeless. "How is my wife? How is Agata? Is she okay?" the businessman asked, his first concern. The doctor and the nurse exchanged quick glances before the doctor informed Ignacio. "I'm very sorry, Ignacio. We did everything we could for your wife, but the bleeding was too severe. In addition, the baby turned out to be quite large. As she was being born, she nicked a vital artery in Agata's body. She didn't stand a chance. Please accept my condolences once again." Ignacio then felt his chin tremble with horror, and tears streamed down his face uncontrollably. "No," he whispered and shook his head in disbelief. "No, this can't be. She couldn't have died. Agata couldn't have." "Katerina, take Ignacio to an empty room and give him a sedative," the doctor commanded the nurse. "We don't need him causing a scene here." Ignacio himself couldn't remember how he ended up in the room, lying on a hard bed, staring at a single point on the ceiling next to an old chandelier. It was only now when he understood that he lost her, he lost his Agata, the only woman with whom he truly felt alive and happy. They had been married for nearly 8 years. 8? He couldn't even believe it. It felt like they had been married for no more than a week or two, and now she was gone. "Oh God, why?" Ignacio roared, his voice echoing like a wounded beast. "Why?" Everything that remained in his chest, all the remnants of his soul, seemed to have been burned to ashes. The pain of loss was so intense that he felt it physically, right where his tortured heart resided. Only later did he remember that their child had been born. "My daughter, how is she?" Ignacio asked the surrounding silence. Jumping out of bed, the man rushed into the doctor's office and asked the surgeon, who had delivered his daughter, the same question. "Please calm down and have a seat," the doctor pointed to a chair. Reluctantly, Ignacio obeyed, and the woman continued. "Your daughter is fine. She is currently in the postnatal capsule. It's completely normal for her condition." The businessman looked at her as if his future depended on her words. "Considering that her mother has passed away, the baby will need to be exclusively fed through artificial means. I advise you to learn about it as quickly as possible." The doctor glanced at Ignacio with a slightly stern expression, but upon seeing his genuine concern for his child and the tragic loss of his wife, she visibly softened. "Listen, I understand what you're going through. Truly, I do. But you are not the first, and unfortunately, not the last man whose wife dies during childbirth. It happens, and sadly, there's nothing we can do about it." The doctor leaned closer to Ignacio and continued, "The only thing you need to focus on right now, to concentrate all your efforts on, is your little daughter in the neonatal unit. She's a fighter, so resilient. So be a living example for her. Be strong, confident in your own success. Believe me, children can sense all of that just as well as adults. Moreover, it's crucial for a child who lost her mother in the first hours of her life." Ignacio nodded slowly and, with a large lump in the throat, he swallowed loudly. If everything the doctor said was true, he would become the best father in the world for his daughter. When he was allowed to take his daughter, Ignacio nearly burst into tears, seeing the tiny baby in a warm pink wrap. That same day, he gave her the name Dorothea. For the next 17 years, the businessman did everything possible for his daughter, ensuring she never stopped feeling his love and support. Although it was initially challenging for the single father, he managed to overcome that difficult period. Despite his constant deals, Ignacio always made an effort to be by his child's side whenever possible. Dorothea never celebrated a birthday or New Year alone or surrounded only by nannies and children from daycare. When Dorothea became deeply interested in artistic gymnastics at the age of 4, her father was amazed by her willpower and determination. Her grandfather, Antonio, greatly supported her in the early years, taking her to training sessions and later to competitions. Dorothea adored her grandfather and considered him her second best friend on earth after her father. Unfortunately, Antonio was already quite elderly at the time and, like his late wife, had heart problems. When Dorothea turned 9, her grandfather passed away. His cause of death was a massive stroke, which immediately led to fatal complications for his heart. Dorothea cried for a long time and deeply mourned his loss. She couldn't imagine life without her beloved grandfather. Therefore, Ignacio was forced to take an unplanned leave of absence from his company for an indefinite period. For the following 2 weeks, he never left his daughter's side, constantly comforting and distracting her until the grief of the young child gradually subsided. Over time, Dorothea returned to her usual daily routine and constant training, and it saved and helped her finally calm down and become stronger and more resilient in spirit. "I will dedicate every victory of mine to my grandfather," Dorothea promised her father once. "I believe that he, along with my mom and grandma, is watching over me from heaven and would love to see me succeed in sports." "Of course, my dear," the businessman smiled affectionately, gently stroking his daughter's soft, light chestnut hair. "You are an incredibly wise girl. I'm very glad that you were able to let go of your grandfather and continue to enjoy life." "I love you, Dad," Dorothea replied briefly and hugged her father tightly around the neck. "Ignacio, are you okay? Can you hear me?" Franco, the driver, called out to the businessman when they were already approaching the office, bringing him out of his contemplative state. "What? Oh, yes, of course, Franco. Did you say something?" Ignacio couldn't immediately return to reality. Franco looked at him attentively in the rearview mirror but didn't say anything. He often noticed how his boss immersed himself in his thoughts during the drive and had become accustomed to it. "Yes, I was saying that the HR department just called. They said they managed to find a new receptionist for you," Franco responded, smoothly parking the owner's car. "They asked you to take a look at her. They say she is very competent. She even worked for your competitors some time ago, but left because she wasn't satisfied with the salary." "Is that so?" Ignacio scoffed. "Well, all right, let's see who this lady is. I hope she can at least brew good coffee." A quarter of an hour later, he was greeting a tall, long-legged beauty in her 30s into his office. Extending her graceful, slender hand, the woman introduced herself as Graciela and told the businessman about her extensive experience in the secretarial field. The company director noted to himself with satisfaction that the recruiters hadn't lied to him. This sultry brunette with full lips and a slender waist carried herself with dignity and presented herself as a true professional, and her stunning appearance was just the icing on the cake, perfectly matching the requirements of such a reputable company they were. "I believe we'll work well together, Graciela. Congratulations, you're hired. Of course, you'll have to go through a probationary period at first, but I don't think you'll have any problems with that." Graciela smiled at him with a captivating, bright smile, then elegantly tossed a strand of her dark, bitter coffee-colored hair over her shoulder. "Thank you, Ignacio," she purred. "I am sure that I will enjoy working in your company. I can feel the positive energy everywhere here." The woman effortlessly rose from her chair, and in that moment, a small but quite enticing part of her sun-kissed décolletage was revealed to the businessman. Graciela smiled again, while Ignacio involuntarily blushed, making it momentarily difficult for him to breathe. Since the death of his beloved wife Agata, the businessman had never married again. Moreover, he had not been able to find a worthy companion with whom he could spend carefree time and with whom he could easily open up his soul, just as he had done with his wife. He also worried about Dorothea. How would the girl react to another woman in his life? Could she get along with a hypothetical stepmother, or would their relationship be constantly strained? All these fears tormented Ignacio and prevented him from truly relaxing in the company of a pleasant woman. Later, he completely dismissed these thoughts, citing his age and constant business engagements, saying, "Who would marry someone as busy as me?" And now, before him stood this stunning Graciela, whose smile could drive any sensible man crazy with just a snap of her fingers. The businessman's heart raced faster as he imagined marrying such a beautiful woman. However, Ignacio quickly pushed such thoughts out of his mind. He didn't want to become a bad example of the famous joke about the boss and his faithful secretary lover. Gathering all his self-control, Ignacio politely bid farewell to the young woman, who responded with a promising smile before gracefully slipping out through the partially open door of his office. With relief, the businessman leaned back in his chair and took a few deep breaths. Well, he certainly didn't expect this turn of events, not even from himself. Could it be that for the first time in all these years, a genuine and passionate feeling had ignited in his heart? Could this be the autumn of love those famous poets often sang about in their verses? In any case, I should take a closer look at this Graciela, Ignacio thought to himself. It's not suitable for me, at my age, to recklessly dive headfirst into this. I need to wait a bit. Having made up his mind, the man struggled to focus on work and dedicated the rest of the day to completing his regular reports. However, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get the image of the beautiful secretary out of his mind, with whom he now had to work side by side. "You're such an old fool," Ignacio scolded himself. "God forbid you fall in love in your old age. What will you do with all these feelings?" He shook his head, reproaching himself for his emotional indiscretion, and only managed to calm down after splashing cold water on his face for several minutes. At the same time, Graciela left the building with a content smile on her face and got into a taxi. Giving the driver an address, she leaned against the car window and thought happily to herself, "Gotcha, my dear. Now I'll reel you in completely. It's a sin to let such a treasure slip away. It's time for me to get my fair share of happiness with a millionaire. I'll finish one business first, and then I'll focus on you, Ignacio." "Turn it up," she said to the driver, and he adjusted the radio volume. The car filled with some pop melody in which the singer happily boasted about her wealth and happiness to the listeners, which consisted of private planes, diamonds, and rich idiots. In reality, Graciela didn't particularly like music, but this song couldn't have better reflected her exhilarated mood at the moment. A couple of weeks after that, Ignacio's life sharply divided into before and after. The businessman, as usual, dropped off his daughter at practice and headed to the office himself. Dorotea, a recent graduate, had decided to fully commit her life to artistic gymnastics. That's why she wanted to compete in the regional championships first and then prepare for admission to a sports college. Nothing on that day foreshadowed the terrible tragedy that would soon burst into Ignacio's life like a horrifying storm. He was working at his office when his mobile phone unexpectedly rang. Holding the screen to his face, the man was surprised to see that it was his daughter calling. Strange, he thought to himself. Dorotea never calls during practice. Could something have happened? Feeling a slight sense of unease in his heart, Ignacio answered the call. "Hello," he cautiously spoke. "Hello. Is it Ignacio Ortiz?" inquired an unfamiliar female voice. "Yes," he replied with a trembling voice. "Why are you calling from my daughter's phone? Who is this?" There was a 1-second pause on the other end of the line, and then the same voice said, "My name is Irma Vidal. I am your daughter's coach. She just fainted during practice. I don't know what happened to her, but the ambulance has taken her now. It would be better if you come to the hospital. I'll tell the address to you." Ignacio felt the ground slipping from under his feet, and everything turned dark in his eyes. Struggling to maintain composure and prevent himself from fainting, he wrote down the hospital address after drinking a large glass of water with a tranquilizer pill. Then he drove there. When he explained who he was and why he had come at the reception, he was immediately taken to the doctor who was handling Dorothea's condition after her admission. Looking at the doctor, the businessman noted with disappointment that his expression was deeply concerned. "Please, explain to me what is happening with my Dorothea," Ignacio pleaded when they entered the doctor's office. The doctor hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to begin, and then finally asked with a sigh, "Have you ever noticed any suspicious symptoms in your daughter, such as sudden bruises, weakness, or elevated body temperature without apparent cause?" The businessman shook his head, confused. "No, never. My daughter is an athlete. Of course, she often gets bruises, but nothing like what you're talking about. Besides, Dorothea has never complained about anything. You see, I work a lot. Although I try to be home more often, it's not always possible." The doctor twirled the pen in his hands thoughtfully before responding. "I see. Well, in that case, I have bad news for you." Ignacio tensed up, unable to even imagine what the doctor was about to say. "Oh God, what's wrong with my daughter?" he asked quietly. "There are suspicions that Dorothea has acute leukemia. The tests showed a monstrously elevated level of certain enzymes responsible for blood clotting. Unfortunately, such a condition can appear at almost any age. And teenagers who engage in strenuous physical activities are also at risk. I'm sorry." Ignacio lowered his gaze, unable to look at the doctor. It hadn't fully sunk in yet that his daughter was in mortal danger. Glancing at his knees, the businessman was surprised to see his hands trembling slightly. It felt as if he were trapped in a terrible dream, a nightmare, with only one way out: to wake up. "Tell me, can I do anything to help her?" the businessman asked the doctor with a faltering voice. His own voice seemed alien to him, as if he were seeing and hearing himself from a distance, like in a movie. The doctor looked at him attentively and replied with a sigh. "Yes, but time is not on our side. We will conduct further examinations, so for now, the girl will remain under our supervision. You can provide a blood sample for analysis. If there is a full match, then we can proceed with a bone marrow transplant from you to your daughter. That's the only way to completely overcome the disease." A tiny glimmer of hope ignited in the businessman's eyes upon hearing the doctor's words. "Of course, doctor. I'm ready to do anything, even offer myself as a spare part, as long as my little girl recovers." "Very well," nodded the doctor. "Then let's go. You need to be prepared." At this point, Ignacio stopped the doctor, lightly touching his hand. "Excuse me, but can I see Dorothea? I need to talk to my daughter, to explain everything to her. She must be terrified right now." The doctor's voice sounded gentle as he replied, "Don't worry. She already knows everything. Your daughter is a true fighter." She has taken such news so calmly. The doctor looked at the businessman with a hint of envy. "You know, if I had a daughter like her, I would be incredibly proud. She has such resilience and will to live." Ignacio nodded absent-mindedly. "Yes, she's such a person. You're not the first one to tell me the same." Several hours later, after all the necessary tests had been conducted, the doctor stepped out of the office, frowning at the results. From the doctor's expression, the businessman understood that something was significantly displeasing him. "Doctor, what is it? Can I be a donor for Dorothea?" The doctor slowly tore his gaze away from the papers. His eyes were filled with regret and sadness. "To my great regret, Ignacio, you can't be her donor." In that moment, the world instantly lost its color in the businessman's eyes. Ignacio felt his hands grow cold suddenly and slowly sat on the edge of a chair in the hallway. "But why?" he managed to ask. "It happens often," the doctor answered as calmly as possible. "Don't despair prematurely. We simply need a closer relative with similar genetic material. Does your daughter have any siblings? Perhaps her mother could also try to donate her blood?" The despondent millionaire could hardly respond. "Her mother died many years ago during childbirth. I'm the only one she has left." Dorothea doesn't have any siblings. The doctor pursed his lips and sat down next to the businessman. In that case, your only option is to urgently find a donor. I will, of course, send inquiries through my channels, but the chance of finding a suitable match quickly is extremely low. Try to find any other relatives of Dorothea, preferably on the maternal side. Even distant relatives may accidentally have a matching phenotype that would work for us. Ignacio listened to the doctor, his mind shrouded in a fog. Finally, turning to the doctor, he looked pleadingly at him. Can I still see Dorothea, please? Of course, let's go, the doctor instantly responded, leading the man to a separate room where his daughter had been transferred upon Ignacio's request after the initial examination and provision of necessary care. Daddy! Dorothea exclaimed, and her father rushed to her, tightly embracing her. Dorothea, my dear, how are you? The businessman asked, tears already glistening in his eyes. Dorothea looked very pale, but she held up remarkably. When she spoke, her voice sounded almost spirited. I'm okay, considering what happened to me. Dad, how is this possible? Why did this disease choose me? There was no fear in Dorothea's eyes, but they held a tremendous question and a sense of injustice. What about my competitions, my training? The girl tried to talk about the most everyday things, obviously trying to push away the darkest thoughts. Ignacio smiled at his daughter through tears and gently stroked her face as if she were made of crystal. I'm afraid we'll have to say goodbye to that for some time, he said slowly. Right now, the most important thing is your health. After a brief pause, the businessman decided to be honest with his daughter. Dorothea, unfortunately, I won't be able to be your donor. My blood is not a match for you. But I will definitely solve this issue, find a donor. I promise you. Upon learning that their last hope had indeed vanished, Dorothea couldn't hold back her tears. How long, Dad? What do you mean, sweetheart? He didn't understand. How long do I have? The man sighed heavily, and upon hearing that sigh, the girl understood that her time was running out. I see, Dorothea slowly said. So, it seems this may be our last meeting. She looked at her father so piercingly that his heart constricted. No, no way, Ignacio tried to reassure her. I will come to you again, just let me try to find someone whose blood will definitely match yours. I will save you, my daughter. I promise. Dorothea gently stroked her father's cheek and spoke. Promise me that you won't give up. Even if I'm no longer in your life, you must live and remember me. Then I'll be at peace up there. The girl looked up at the ceiling, envisioning the sky where her mother, grandfather, and grandmother resided. Don't say such things to me. Ignacio exclaimed in despair. You will live, do you hear me? You will. Ignacio began to cover Dorothea's weakened hand with kisses, assuring her that he would visit her again in a few days. As a final act, his daughter also kissed him on the cheek before he entrusted her to the care of the doctors and left the hospital in a state as if a train had just run him over. Only a month remained for his daughter because the disease had struck her with terrible force. The doctor said that the leukemia outbreak may have been triggered by intense stress before the competitions. For the first time in his life, Ignacio regretted enrolling his daughter in artistic gymnastics. Overwhelmed, the man sank down on the cold stone steps leading to the medical facility and, in despair, covered his head with his hands. What was he supposed to do now? Where could he find that cursed donor when the entire Agata family had long been dead? He had never heard of any other relatives. In that moment, he caught a glimpse out of the corner of his eye of a woman stopped in front of him. Or rather, he saw only her legs, clad in open-toed summer shoes. A long blue skirt made of light fabric flowed around her legs. Ignacio slowly looked at her, exhausted from his own emotions. Who are you? He asked, looking at the smiling fortune teller who was casually strolling through the city streets at this hour. My name is Jacinta. The fortune teller replied solemnly and extended her hand to him. I can see that you need help, dear. Let me read your palm. Don't worry, I won't take any money from you. I can tell when people genuinely worry about their troubles and when they seek fortune-telling just for fun. The most interesting part was that Jacinta didn't look like a typical gypsy from a wandering camp. She was a decently dressed young woman, around 25 to 27 years old, with long light hair tied up in a high ponytail. She wore a light blue denim jacket casually draped over her snowy, aristocratic-like shoulders. Her blue eyes looked at Ignacio with such genuine sympathy and warmth that he couldn't bring himself to dismiss her. I don't think you can help me, the businessman responded wearily. I doubt anyone can find the answer to the question that now is making me worry more than anything in the world. The fortune teller's eyebrows lifted in surprise. Do you not believe in the power of my gift, or do you think that because I don't look like a typical gypsy, I'm of no use? Well, let me tell you, my grandmother was an Irish gypsy. That's why we're all fair-skinned, unlike those of Egyptian descent. Ignacio looked at the girl with curiosity. It's the first time I've heard of that, he said, slowly standing up. Well then, Jacinta, if you're so sure of yourself, go ahead. He extended his hand to the fortune teller, who instantly grabbed it, carefully examining the finest lines on his palm and fingers. Throughout this process, Jacinta rotated his wrist this way and that, while occasionally making affirming humming sounds, as if she had already figured everything out and was merely seeking confirmation of her astonishing discovery. It's all clear now, she finally pronounced, looking at the wealthy man with genuine concern. Someone very close to you by blood is seriously ill, either your daughter or sister. I believe it's your daughter. You want to help her, but you don't know how. Fate says you need to find another one. Only then you can save her. Ignacio, who had been standing and listening to the fortune teller with undisguised astonishment, suddenly furrowed his brow. So, what do you mean by find another one? What does all this mean? Jacinta glanced at his palm once again and nodded affirmatively. That's right. There can be no doubt. So says the prophecy. Ignacio snatched his hand from her grasp and muttered disappointedly. What are saying? And I almost fell for it. Oh, God. Understanding that the businessman didn't believe her, Jacinta simply shrugged her shoulders. It's up to you. I told you the whole truth as it is. You can only save your daughter like this. If you let it go on its own, don't speak bad of me later because I warned you. With these words, Jacinta dignifiedly walked away towards the park, leaving the puzzled and shocked wealthy man alone with his thoughts. Find another one, what could that mean? The businessman pondered. Although he didn't believe in the prediction of this strange blonde woman, deep down he felt that there was something useful in that phrase, something that could help him find a way out of the terrible situation with Dorothea that had befallen them. Jacinta was already heading back home when she witnessed a horrifying scene. While crossing a bridge, the fortune teller saw a young girl, around 17 to 18 years old, climbing over the railings. Her intention was all too evident, so Jacinta quickly rushed towards her and miraculously managed to grab the distressed girl by the shoulder, pulling her towards herself. Have you lost your mind? She shouted at the girl when they both sat on the ground, the girl clutching her trembling heart. Has life bothered you so much? And if it has? The sad girl replied, her eyes welling up with large tears. If I simply have no reason to live anymore? What do you suggest I do? Beg for mercy. After catching her breath, the street fortune teller knelt next to the girl. Listen, I understand that something has happened to you. Apparently, something very bad, since you decided to jump from the bridge into the river. But the most horrible and unfair things in the world shouldn't push you to such foolishness, do you understand? Life is the most important and valuable thing we have. Can you just try to leave it like that? The young stranger looked at the fortune teller, her face filled with despair and suffering. I've been deceived, she tried to explain. Deceived so much that now I don't even know how to go on living or what to do. Jacinta looked at her with doubt. By a guy, I suppose? No, not at all. The stranger waved her hand dismissively, attempting to stand up. But she still felt a bit shaky from the shock. My own aunt. She tricked me, took away my apartment, changed the locks. I couldn't even retrieve my belongings before she kicked me out like a kitten. The girl covered her face with her hands and burst into bitter tears. Jacinta felt sorry for this naive young girl who was willing to give up on life because of some miserable square meters. That's when the fortune teller offered her. "You know what? Let's go to my place right now," Jacinta suggested. "I'll make you some hot coffee, and we can have a meal together. And you can tell me everything in detail, who deceived you and how. Maybe I can help you in some way." The girl looked at Jacinta with red, teary eyes and nodded gratefully. "Thank you. And please forgive me. I didn't mean to scare anyone. I just was in despair." "Don't worry, I'm not one to hold grudges," the fortune teller grinned and extended her hand for a handshake. "My name is Jacinta, by the way. And you?" "Linda," the girl nodded, shaking her hand in return. "What a beautiful name you have." "Thank you," Jacinta explained. "It's just not very common these days. My grandmother chose it for me. She hoped I would make fewer mistakes in my life than my mother did. Grandma used to say that someone from her admirers sent her to the afterlife out of jealousy," Jacinta casually mentioned as they set the kettle and placed some fragrant sand cookies on a saucer. By that time, they had arrived at the fortune teller's small apartment. "How terrible!" Linda exclaimed, raising her hands. "How did you manage to get through it?" The woman simply shrugged and threw her jacket on the old sofa. "I don't know. I was only 5 years old at the time, and my grandmother raised me. She always took care of me even before that, while my mother was busy with her personal life. But when all this happened, she took me away and we moved here, to the city. We've been living together ever since. She taught me her craft, and I became her best helper around the house. It's just a shame she didn't live to see my high school graduation. Grandma made me a dress that made all my classmates green with envy." "Losing a mother is the biggest tragedy in a person's life," Linda said pensively, and then added, "I lost mine too. Quite recently, just 4 months ago." "I'm sorry to hear that," the fortune teller lowered her gaze. "What happened? Forgive me if I'm prying into your business. You promised to tell me what happened to you. Remember?" Linda sadly looked at her new acquaintance. "It was an accident. My mom was coming home from work. She was crossing the road. At that moment, a car lost control. The police said its brakes failed or something like that. Anyway, my mom didn't make it. She was hit by that car." Jacinta looked at her with sympathy. "And then her sister, my aunt, appeared," the girl continued. "I had just finished school and was planning to go to college for history. Suddenly, everything came crashing down on me, my mom's death, the uncertainty of what to do next." Linda took a deep breath before she continued. "She appeared for the first time at the funeral. She was all beautiful and caring. She helped me with the memorial service. But then, when all the guests left, it was like she was replaced. She turned into a cold, calculating witch. That's who she really is." "Well, it seems you have quite strained relations with this aunt of yours," Jacinta remarked, astonished. "That's an understatement," Linda said, wiping away tears of anger with her fist. "She only wanted my mother's apartment, that's all. She complained to me about how she was living alone in such a huge 2-bedroom apartment while she had to rent places. Since she's my aunt, she believed she was entitled to a share of our mother's property too. I tried to explain to her that she wasn't mentioned there at all, but this woman turned out to be incredibly stubborn." The fortune teller listened without interrupting, giving Linda the opportunity to vent. In the end, Linda continued, "My aunt proposed an exchange of apartments so that neither of us would feel offended. I was disappointed, but then I felt sorry for her. She and my mother had a difficult relationship. I don't know what caused it, but it must have been something serious. They wouldn't have had such a falling out over something trivial." Linda took a big sip of coffee and concluded her gloomy story. "I agreed to the exchange, but she brought her lawyer. I couldn't even properly read what I was signing. It's my own fault, of course. I should have insisted on being given time to review the documents, but it turned out that there was no exchange at all. I signed over my mother's apartment to her, that wicked aunt. At this point, the girl couldn't hold back her emotions and burst into tears. What a fool I am. She cursed herself. How could I have believed her? Well, you didn't know she would stoop so low and deceive you like that, the fortune teller tried to console her. We always expect betrayal from strangers, not from our loved ones. But Linda shook her head in disagreement. I should have felt it. I should have suspected that if she was behaving so strangely and persistently, she must have had something malicious in mind. But I fell for it like a fool. The girl told Jacinta that when she returned from her preparatory courses for college the next day, she couldn't get into her own home. She knocked on the door for a long time until her aunt finally opened it and loudly declared that the apartment now belonged to her and that Linda had been cleverly tricked. Can you imagine how I felt? She asked the fortune teller. She told me she changed the locks, and now there was nothing in that house that belonged to me. And when I asked her where I should go now, you know what she said? Jacinta looked at the girl with curiosity. She said that I can try to get into college on my first attempt and immediately enroll in the full-time program on a scholarship. Then, she said, I would be entitled to a room in the dormitory and have a place to live. The young fortune teller was shocked by the cynicism of this horrible woman and patted Linda on the shoulder. Okay, don't worry. We'll come up with something. And until then, you can stay with me for as long as you want. You're a good girl. I can see that you're not lying about your aunt and your situation. Any of us could end up in such a situation. If you only knew what I sometimes see when I read people's palms or do card readings. Jacinta nodded meaningfully. In Linda's eyes, a tiny spark of hope appeared at that moment. Thank you so much. She thanked the fortune teller warmly. I will definitely find a job, you'll see. I'll help you clean, do chores. I can help with cooking if you want. In response, Jacinta advised the girl not to worry and promised her that she would definitely come up with a way to teach her aunt a lesson and get Linda her rightful apartment back. For the next couple of weeks, Linda was living in Jacinta's small apartment and helped her with household chores while the young fortune teller made a living entertaining passersby in the park, at the weekend fair, and by providing personal card readings and individual astrological forecasts, for which, as Jacinta assured, she always received the biggest payments. Linda also didn't waste any time and attended various job interviews. After the shocking story with her aunt and the apartment, she wouldn't be able to properly prepare for the entrance exams, so she decided to try to find any job to not rely on Jacinta's support and, at the same time, gain the much-needed experience that would make her more desirable to decent companies. At the same time, Ignacio tried to hold on with his last strength. He was constantly searching for a suitable donor for his daughter, but so far, it was all in vain. As before, the businessman visited Dorotea in the hospital, but with each visit, he became more convinced that time was running out for her. Despite the coordinated and competent actions of the doctors, as well as the necessary medications in such a situation, the girl still needed urgent surgery. Everyone, including Dorothea herself, understood this and didn't lose hope of finally finding a suitable donor. Recalling the fortune teller's strange prediction, Ignacio couldn't decipher its message, but he still heeded Jacinta's words about bloodlines and hired the best detectives in the city to try to locate any distant relatives of his late wife. You need to calm down, Ignacio, Graciela cooed affectionately around him, offering the man a cup of coffee with dark bitter chocolate on a saucer, his favorite treat that helped him relieve the intense stress. I'm sure that sooner or later you will achieve your goal, and Dorothea will definitely recover. At the same time, the secretary looked at her boss with such longing in her eyes every time that he involuntarily turned away. He still had strong feelings for this elegant woman, and it seemed she was not against developing their relationship, but right now Ignacio had no time for that. His main priority, as he always said, was his daughter. Seeing that she couldn't seem to captivate this cold rich man, Graciela was gnawing at her nails under the table while maintaining the friendliest smile she could muster. Damn this Dorothea. She raged in her thoughts. Why did she have to follow now, just when something was starting between us? Couldn't she wait a year until her daddy and I got married? Then she could have died to her heart's content. No one would stop her. I would have inherited all his fortune, and I would have found a way to use my husband's money wisely. Nurturing such cunning plans, Graciela continued working at Ignacio's company while simultaneously attempting to conquer this impregnable fortress. One weekday, as Ignacio was attentively studying the terms of an upcoming deal, his phone suddenly erupted with a melodious ringtone. When he picked up the receiver, it turned out to be one of the detectives he had sent in search of Agata's relatives. "So, any news?" the businessman asked hopefully. "Yes and no," the investigator evasively replied. "You see, it turns out Agata doesn't have any relatives left, none at all." Ignacio's heart immediately sank somewhere deep into the darkest abyss. "Are you sure? Maybe you didn't search thoroughly?" After all, her family was considered quite well known in their time. "Are you telling me there are no distant cousins or siblings?" The man deeply sighed. "Believe me, Ignacio, we scoured all the archives of the town and village where your wife was born, and we found nothing, absolutely nothing. However, as I mentioned before, we did manage to find something interesting." The businessman immediately remained focused. "And what is it? Speak up, don't keep me waiting." "When we checked the records of the hospital where your wife gave birth, we discovered an intriguing detail," the detective cautiously began. "Tell me, Ignacio, were you aware that Agata gave birth to twins?" "What?" The businessman couldn't believe his ears. "Think before you speak, Salvador. What are you talking about? My wife never cheated on me, and she was never pregnant before Dorotea." Slowly, it began to dawn on the wealthy man, and the detective confirmed his suspicion. "That's precisely why I'm asking. It pertains to the only childbirth event," he said slowly. "In one of the 2 birth certificates I found, it states that your wife gave birth to 2 girls, identical twins." Ignacio anxiously rubbed his forehead in his office. He simply couldn't understand what was happening. "But the doctor never told us anything like that. I don't understand how this could be possible." "Did you make an ultrasound?" the detective asked. "Yes, but can you imagine what it was like back then? The only device in the whole town, and it was always malfunctioning. Perhaps there was an error, and the doctor who performed the ultrasound simply didn't see the second child. But that still doesn't explain the fact that I never knew anything about the second daughter. Where is she, then?" The detective paused for a moment, apparently considering how best to deliver the next piece of news. "And here we come to the most interesting part. Along with your wife, another woman was giving birth on that day, the daughter of the same midwife who attended Agata's delivery. And according to the documents, the midwife's granddaughter died at that time. She suffocated, entangled in the umbilical cord." "My goodness!" Ignacio couldn't hold back. "But what does that have to do with me?" "Unfortunately, it has a direct relation, Ignacio," the detective continued. "As I mentioned before, the main peculiarity was that there were initially 2 copies of each report, one for your wife and one for the midwife's daughter. In Agata's case, it states that one of the twins died shortly after birth, following the mother. But in the report of the midwife's daughter, it's the complete opposite. So they gave my little daughter to her?" Ignacio finally realized. "I'm afraid so," Salvador replied sadly. "Both reports were found by my team in a hidden compartment of the chief doctor's drawer. Don't ask how we did it. We won't tell you anyway," the detective returned with a touch of professional humor. "The fact is that the midwife's daughter never found out. She thought she had given birth to her own child. And soon after that, the woman, her daughter, and their grandmother moved somewhere up north. And there, their traces were completely lost." "So you don't know where my daughter is now?" Ignacio asked quietly. "Unfortunately, that's all we managed to find out," the detective replied. "But now you know that somewhere out there, another Ortiz exists. And if you're lucky enough to find her, how? How am I supposed to find her if I relied on you in this matter? Ignacio erupted at the detective. I don't have any more time, and Dorothea doesn't have any more time. She's dying, damn it, you fool. It took Ignacio a second to regain his composure and apologize to the detective. Thanking him for his work, Ignacio hung up the phone and slowly sank into his office chair. So, he had been deceived in the most audacious way, with only one of the twins being handed over. His wife's medical record was completely fabricated, and it seemed even the midwife herself didn't know that Agata was carrying twins. When his wife passed away, the midwife thought it wouldn't be so bad if she gave her daughter one of the twins, so that the young woman wouldn't go crazy with grief upon learning of her own baby's death. Ignacio felt completely empty and broken. His last hope died before it could materialize. Right now, the businessman only knew one thing: if he lost Dorothea, he would lose all motivation to live and work. His daughter meant everything to him, and he certainly didn't want to live in a world without her. 3 days later, Jacinta brought Linda a newspaper with free advertisements. Here, I took this along the way. Maybe you'll find something decent here, the fortune teller suggested, seeing the girl's desperate struggle looking for a job. Wherever she went during this time, she was always offered to first take some paid courses or simply turned away, citing the lack of experience for the girl who just graduated from school. In the end, Linda became disheartened and was about to try to get a bank loan to undergo at least some kind of training that could help her get a job, when Jacinta managed to convince her that all these loans and courses were nothing more than a well-thought-out scheme paid for by the same enthusiasts as Linda herself, just empty promises. You'd better browse through this newspaper, she urged the girl, who had become her best friend during this time. They always publish job vacancies for people. Maybe something will catch your eye. The girl followed the fortune teller's advice and carefully studied the thin magazine. After agonizing deliberation between a dishwasher position and a janitor, Linda ultimately chose the latter. And rightly so. Jacinta encouraged her. Certainly not the most prestigious profession, but the company is very good and well known. Plus, they promise a decent salary, much better than what the school offers. It's worth trying for an interview. Linda agreed with a sigh. It wasn't the career she had dreamed of, but on the other hand, she had to start somewhere. Arriving at the specified address, the girl discovered a large and bright office of a construction company, inside of which cleanliness and beauty reigned. However, as she climbed to the 5th floor to reach the company's director, Linda froze in place, unable to utter a word. She was pale as a chalk. In that moment, her only desire was to disappear into the ground, but it was already too late. Graciela noticed her and now stood, blocking Linda's path to the director's office, with her hands on her hips. "It's you?" the secretary hissed. "What are you doing here, you little brat?" Linda stared straight at the woman, never taking her angry but proud gaze off her. "I came to apply for a job." "Let me through," she said, and attempted to pass by Graciela, but she rudely grabbed the girl by the shoulders. "So, you're applying for the janitor position? My, oh my, I've been wondering what could brought you here." The secretary's gaze at that moment resembled that of a snake preparing for a deadly strike. "Not today, my dear," Linda pushed Graciela to the other end of the corridor. "You have no business here. I don't want it to accidentally turn out that we're related. It would be such a disgrace for me if someone knew we're related. It's such a mess." Graciela looked at the young girl with all the malice and hatred that boiled in her soul at that moment. Hearing strange shouts and commotion behind the door, Ignacio decided to leave his office and see what was happening. "Graciela, what's going on? Did the girl come for the interview or not? The HR department has been calling me. They say they lost her," he said. Graciela wanted to explain something to him, but she saw her boss turn pale at the sight of her niece. "Ignacio, what's the matter with you?" the secretary cautiously asked, and the ugly smile instantly vanished from her face. "Dorothea?" the businessman managed to say. The girl looked at him, fully confused. She shifted her gaze from her aunt to him and back again. Graciela turned to her niece, and Linda could swear she saw a fiery blaze of fury in her eyes. "Get out of here immediately," Graciela ordered her. However, Ignacio reached out to the girl and shook his head. "No, let her stay. Please, miss. I don't know your name. Spare me a couple of minutes, I'm begging you," he pleaded. Linda didn't know what to do, but the despair written on this man's face convinced the former schoolgirl to agree. "Fine," she simply said, and followed Ignacio. He was in a state of complete shock because before him stood the spitting image of his daughter. Could this be true, and was this girl really his lost daughter, Dorothea's twin? If so, he had one last chance to save his child. "Please, let's do a DNA test," he pleaded with her in his office. "My daughter's life is fading away. The doctors have done everything they could. If it turns out that you are my sister's daughter, it could literally save her life." Linda doubted that such a thing could actually happen, but the story that the businessman told her about himself, his daughter, and the results of the investigation still convinced the girl to trust him. After all, if it was true and Dorothea was her sister, it meant she would have another family. Agreeing to the test and analysis, Linda and Ignacio immediately went to the hospital. When they took the girl's blood for all the necessary tests, the man led her to his daughter's room. Dorothea, of course, was as shocked as her father, but she reacted very positively to Linda's arrival. She greeted the girl warmly and then said, "Such coincidences don't happen in life. Can't you see that we look alike, like two peas in a pod? You must be my lost sister. Dad told me everything." Linda felt like she had entered some kind of fantastical movie. She had no doubt that she and Dorothea looked similar, but she had never felt like she had a sister, let alone a twin. And yet, twins are supposed to sense these things even from a distance. "Congratulations. The test confirmed your kinship, it's 100%. Ignacio announced with a joyful smile to Linda and the doctors. "If Linda is ready, we can begin the preparation process for the surgery." All of this was so unexpected and swift for the young girl. "Of course, let's get started," she could only nod. The preparation went well, and soon Dorothea received a bone marrow transplant and a blood transfusion from her biological sister. After that, the girl quickly started to recover, while Linda, who shared the same hospital room, still couldn't believe that she had gained both a sister and a father. In the midst of the events, Linda didn't immediately remember that she wanted to talk to Ignacio. When she felt better, she asked for a few minutes with her father and warned him about Graciela. "Please don't trust that woman," she spoke with a weak voice after the surgery. "She's not as sweet and kind as she is pretending to be." In broad strokes, the girl recounted to her newfound father the story about his apartment and how she was now living with the fortune teller Jacinta. Upon hearing about the latter, Ignacio immediately recalled her prophecy, "Find another one." Oh God, now he got it. She was referring to Dorothea as her sister, and he didn't immediately realize it. Upon learning about his secretary's deception, the businessman was furious at her behavior. The next day, he fired the wretch and threatened her with jail if she didn't transfer the apartment back to Linda. Graciela, though she had desired wealth, wanted to stay free even more, so she returned the apartment to her niece and permanently left the city. Fully recovered, Linda was happy to learn that she could now return home. She planned to attend college as she had wanted and promised her father that she would visit him and Dorothea at the first opportunity. The girls had no doubt they would become friends, so in that regard, businessman Ignacio was reassured and very pleased. Ignacio invited Jacinta to work with him as a token of gratitude for helping his lost daughter. The young woman became his personal astrologer, and she was very happy that her prophecy, having come true, saved the life of an entire family. Gradually, tender feelings arose between her and Ignacio. Their relationship smoothly transitioned from professional to romantic. After getting to know Jacinta better, Ignacio realized that she could become his new breath of life and create the missing domestic comfort he had longed for. They soon married, and the wedding was beautiful, leaving guests with many pleasant memories. Now, they all live together in the millionaire's house, enjoying every day that offers them the chance to rediscover joy in life and learn new sides of each other.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.